Loren, welcome back to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate you having me on.
My pleasure. You're a very busy man, diving between different conferences and obviously work and family and things. So I appreciate you making a bit of time for me. But if anyone doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a brief background to you and how you ended up at Notre Dame?
Sure. I've been in the performance field for over 30 years now. I've been over here at Notre Dame for 17 months. Before that, I've been in the NFL, I've been in the private sector, I've been a consultant for Olympic teams, for NFL football teams, Major League Baseball. Did NFL combine prep for over 20 years. And, a little tidbit about me, most people don't know, but I started in our field in cardiac and pulmonary rehab is where I actually started. So a long time ago.
Nice. I know you had the facility in Denver.
Yeah, I
Is it
guess
still
I
there?
didn't even mention that. I still own the facility in Denver. I have 30 coaches there that are operating it and doing a much better job now that I'm out of their hair.
So how do you manage that? Do you still have daily input? What's the deal?
No, I have three people who I've triangulated as management, and they agree, disagree, and come to big decisions and small decisions all on their own. And they go through the hiring and firing process, and I've trusted them to run and operate it. So I don't do anything from here.
And so do you own? Sorry to get into the weeds of this, but do you own 100% of the business, or do you have investors? And how does that
100%
work?
owner.
Good work.
I learned a long time ago, in a previous life of performance that, if it's going to sink or if it's going to swim, it's going to be on me. And I never wanted to be tied to investors. I never wanted to be owing anybody money. I wanted to sit there and say, if this is going to work, it's going to be either on me. If it's going to fail, it's going to be on me.
Yeah, love that. Love that. And so how does that feel as a business owner who's been in it for so long, stepping away and going over to you guys?
Yeah, I think I had my first dry run of that when I went to the Broncos, and
Okay.
I was still local enough, but I think that was my first dry run, and to see how my staff and the employees there operated, it made it really easy for me to make the transition to Notre Dame. I already knew what they were capable of, and I had to put more, more ownership on their plate of like making big decisions and doing the harder things, and they've stepped up to the plate and done a great job.
Any people out there who are trying to build a business or have an established business will know how hard that is to step away and let other people kind of take the reins, especially when you've done it from the ground up. So massive respect to you for that. Um, you're speaking in June at the Sportsmith Return to Play conference in LA, which so thank you for
Yeah.
squeezing into a very busy diary. I'm excited to have you and meet you in person. Would you give us a bit of a brief summary of what you're going to talk about, just so anyone that's interested, can get a bit of feel of what they're getting into?
Sure, it's an ambitious topic where I'm going to talk about return to play, from mostly from a post surgical kind of lens viewpoint, but just taking people through really the movement sequences and the linear and lateral progressions and regressions that ultimately I've used over the course of my career, and I think they've fine tuned over the years, but just taking people into a deep dive. And obviously, lower extremity is it's a lot of things to consider, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's a lot of similarities if we're looking from, from the foot. From the foot to the ankle to the knee to the hip, there's a lot of similar considerations as well. So it's an ambitious topic. I'm excited to see how it goes, but nonetheless, I think there'll be some great opportunity for some good discussion outside of that as well.
Nice, amazing. So anyone that's interested, sportsmith.co/events and all the info about what Lauren's going to talk about and all the other 16 speakers that we've got will be on there.
Amazing, amazing.
Yes, the admin is growing, Lauren, as we go, but it's good. We'll have a good time. So on to today. We had a little bit of a very brief chat beforehand around rehab
Mhm.
and your view on rehab and things, and just going a little bit philosophical to start with, and we'll dial in on the kind of stuff we're going to talk about. How do you view rehab as a
Yeah,
philosophy?
well, philosophically, I look at the big picture, and when I was in the private sector versus being in the team side, you need to have your team that's involved with the rehab, right? Here at Notre Dame, we have our head athletic trainer, we have our doctors, we have our nutritionist, We have our sports science department. We have everybody involved in that process. On the outside, I was kind of a one-man band, and I would, making sure that I was sending out to the radiologists, and I was sending out to different therapists, and I was creating a network on the outside. So first and foremost, it has to be a team approach. Secondly, which I think we're going to discuss this, but there's going to be objective measurement that we're trying to get the athlete back to. But I think the biggest thing that practitioners have to understand, there's an art to this. We always talk about training being this hybrid or this blend of art and science, and I think that's completely RTP. People are pretty rigid on numerical models, and I think at the end of the day, like, it's the communication back and forth with the practitioner or with the athlete. It's practitioners communicating on the back and having good intuition based on rehab cases that they've done in the past. Even though every injury is different, there's similarities in different rehab processes that I've seen as far as timelines. And I don't hold myself tight to timelines, but I understand that there's different tissue healings. But I think at the end of the day, you have to have good sound intuition. You have to watch with your eyes. You have to listen to the athlete. You have to communicate to them. And then, following a lot of Dustin Grims's work is not over communicate to the athlete at various times as well. So it's definitely an art in how you, the psychology piece of it as well. And that's another part of our team that we look at here, as well as the sports psychology piece.
From an industry perspective, and I say industry, performance and medical together, how do you think the development of return to play, especially in the States, I'm fascinated because we have obviously different systems of where we go for certain things and who leads on certain things and how that's the interplay. Where do you think, or what do you think the industry is like when it comes to return to play? Do you think we're getting more integrated? Do you think it's improving? Do you think we're very research led? Do you think it's very medically led? I'm just interested to get your take on, obviously you've been at different scenarios and you've spoken to lots of people. Where do you think it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a broad question that I don't know has a really straightforward answer, but I think it's getting better. I think that good collaborative teams are really coming out with the best outcomes. I do think there's obviously a medical lead without a doubt, and it should be early stages, post-surgical. It's got to be medical led. But then I believe the S&C, AT, and everybody needs to be in together in those early conversations. Nutrition on the best strategies for wound healing and for coming back from the surgical process. Like, I think we've gotten better. I still think people do hold tight to timelines and numerical models that I think which again, it's tough because it takes experience to create the art. The biggest thing that I've probably seen in the States, and I've seen it, is you have return to play situations in a lot of team scenarios, and usually what they do is they stick the least experienced coach with the return to play guys. And to me, like, that's backwards. Like, I need to have my most experienced, my most understanding coaches watching the movements, understanding the progressions, and then ultimately being able to decision make on the regressions. I can't tell you how many times I've built out programming for RTP, and it changes in that session. And so you have to have people in those positions that are adaptable, that are good at decision making as well. And I just don't think the young coaches have the eye or the detail of the historical awareness of what each injury represents and how it presents.
I think that's really interesting because you're seeing more rehab coach specific roles and speaking to guys in the NFL, and that's kind of seeming to be bridging that gap between the medical and the S&C, and the S&Cs are moving that way because they're interested in that stuff. So I think it's a really interesting space. And we did the conference in Manchester in the UK in October, and it was really, really popular. And I think that's why, because people are kind of converging to this grey area in between, trying to fill the gap and just getting excited about that space.
Yeah, and that's just it. And I think we are seeing an uptick in these positions that are being put into these organizations. But if you looked 3, 4, 5 years ago, it was like, oh, you'll go with the intern. You'll go with the fourth coach on staff. And I've that's always just been so backwards to me in how I look at things.
Yeah. Right, let's dive into the detail, or a little bit more of a detail now. So introducing or building back up to linear sprinting and then change direction. What's your sequence of events? You've got the guy's gone through the kind of medically led whether it's post-surgery or no surgery, initial stages, you've got them
Hmm.
moving, they've been handed to you, you're moving them towards this kind of linear sprint, change direction. What's your sequence of events as a global thoughts, and then we'll move into the more detail.
Sure. So say they've gotten the medical clearance to start doing something that looks like movement. The first and foremost thing that I'll start with them in is just things that restore temporal pattern. I just need to restore rhythm from the get-go, and it might be, you know, I'd say rhythm and stability. It might be just like walking marches. It might be, walking dribbles. It might be anything that's a walking tempo. I'm going to start with, and I'll keep a sagittal plane early on, but I'm just trying to restore the rhythm, the bend, the awareness, the kinesthetic awareness, the proprioceptive aspect, the stability that this person has now lost through the course of surgery, whatever the intervention was, whatever the time loss was. I'm just trying to restore that early on. Now, concurrently, I'm working on strength. I'm working on open chain. I'm working on closed chain strength. I want to make sure that I'm not getting to the run portion or the capacity portion too early on the movement, because I want to make sure that I double down on bend and strength. So I need to restore bend. Need to restore stability, and I want to restore relative coordination patterns. I'm not looking for elastic responses, nothing like that, but just the awareness again of going through a walking pattern, backward walking, linear walking, and then starting to raise that sequence to now it's looking a little bit more like a dribble. Now it's maybe a dribble over the ankle. Now maybe it's a dribble over mid shin, but it's all walking. That's all I'm trying to do is reintroduce ground contact and the rhythm and the range of motion. But I do it in very progressive steps. And one thing with my movement integration, I will stay on the same thing for so long. Like people that go through RTP with me, they have got to be okay with me grooving the same things over and over and over again. Matter of fact, I just had a session with some guys who are pretty far through the RTP side, and we grooved the same thing over and over for about 40 minutes. And we just changed the velocity, the intensity, and the requirement. By the time they got through with the work today, like I increased the speed of the movement, and then I increased the decelerative need, and then I introduced a reactive start to it. So to me, I just groove the same things over and over, and then I just change a little stimulus at time to time.
On,
That's the initial stages.
there's tons just on that I can dive into. So just on the psychological side of that, I know you mentioned the psychological piece a little bit earlier. When people are staying in that, like grooving it, as you mentioned, how are
Hmm.
you keeping them
Interested?
engaged and interested and thinking, "Hey, Loren, like let's move on. Like I'm getting bored." Like, how do you keep that engagement going?
I just talked to them about the amount of time that was lost, the intervention that was, whether it was surgical, and we'll just discuss it as surgical, the amount of neurological diminish that has happened. I have to do this thing over and over and over to regain the proprioceptive capacities, the tissue qualities and capacities. Like I have to do these things over and over and over to lay down a strong and sound foundation. We always use the analogy of before you build the big house, you got to build the broad foundation. Well, I use the same conversation, but I tell them early on, you're going to get bored with this. And I change things up enough too, right? I build in different upper body workouts that are more, that are going to create a little bit more of a physiological response that's going to suffice their need to get their heart rate up, to sweat, to do those things. But I have to give them what they need and then provide what they want ancillary to that.
And the next one was obviously we're talking about building up to this linear sprinting. Do you do you have that in your mind that that's the goal? I spoke to a couple of people. He's actually speaking in LA in June alongside yourself, Alan Murdoch, with the
Mm.
speed based approach to rehab, and that's become his kind of thing.
Hmm.
But try like keeping that in mind all the time and
Yeah.
using that progression, throughout as a thread throughout the rehab. Is that similar to how you think about
Yeah.
things?
Absolutely. As soon as I can get them into like what I would consider movement drilling, I get them into it, and that's where I start with those walking patterns. But then, once they're able to, we'll get into A marches, A skips, low amplitude skipping. just general skipping for locomotion is really one of my prerequisites before I really start to run them. So one, I want to then introduce the elastic component, but I'm putting them in, Rob, I'm putting them in wall drill holds, early in their rehab before they start any of the movement progressions, because I need to make sure that I'm getting the Achilles enough stimulation, because if they've been off of any type of real loading or ballistic loading for 2 to 3 months, 4 months, whatever the run progression is, and then you start running them, that's a whole new load that tissue hasn't seen in quite some time in that fashion or in that need. So I'll start them in, like, good old fashioned, wall position iso holds. So I'm getting that eccentric isometric contraction just on the Achilles. So not only am I thinking of where I'm going, but I'm thinking about what other tissues aren't getting stimulation during their recovery process.
Do you have any particular? Again, this is quite broad and not diving in on one particular injury, but that may be something that you do regardless of the injury. But do you have criteria to guide progress no matter what the injury as we move through this process?
Sure. I think we use our objective markers, and some of the objective markers don't matter as much early on in the rehab process. So, if I were sitting there to say, I want to have I have a movement signature on every player that comes into our building before any insult. We have a DARI screen that we do 3 to 4 times a year. We have our Nordboard metrics that we get. We have force plate data that we collect 2 to 3 times a week, year round. We have force frame metrics that we get. So we have metrics in a lot of different ways, and obviously the catapult data as well. So we have this global movement signature on the athletes, and at different phases of their rehab, we'll lean into those things. Maybe early on, it's DARI is more of something that we're going to lean into, and maybe not so much the force plate, because I'm not even considered about force absorption, force execution when I'm just retraining or reteaching things. But as we get further down into that process, then we are going to start to look at those other objective markers. But quite honestly, it's the subjective. Like, what does it look like if I have an athlete and I've built them into a program, and I see that, that unilateral hitch? I see this, movement aberration that I know wasn't there beforehand. Then I know that I need to restore something from a strength side, a capacity side, and it might just be, a bilateral squat, a lunge pattern, a lateral lunge. I know that there's a deficit there, or it may be a stereotype to how they were working through their movement throughout the rehab process early on. And so I have to ask those questions early on, not to get into the weeds with the athlete, but hey, does that create pain? What's the sensation you're having? I need to know these things. And that comes into kind of the art of it. I had a young man who I was taking through an RTP, through a progression, long-term progression, and he didn't even realize he was creating this hitch. And so I ended up filming it and showing him, this is what I see, and tell me what you're feeling. He goes, yeah, I don't know why I'm doing that. And so then, a few more reps into it, it goes away. So to me, it's about being a good investigator through the process. As we get further into the rehab, I'm going to really look at those numbers and say, here's numbers on the catapult I need to get to. But beforehand, I need to make sure that this body of movement looks clean, it looks healthy. The knee fold, like, we'll just say it's a knee injury. The knee folds well in their gait cycle, whether it's walking speed, jogging speed, rhythmic skips, or then once I actually get into the locomotion. So those are all things that I'm looking at subjectively, before I even get into the criteria of subject or objective measures.
One thing we discussed on a previous podcast, and not that you didn't share some unbelievable information, because you did, but my overriding memory of when we spoke last was the Denver backdrop. I can't remember where you were, but wherever you were, you were in your office or something. There was this beautiful blue sky, and it was it was unbelievable. But one thing we discussed then was the foot and ankle, and the importance of the foot and ankle, probably more from a performance perspective when we talked back then. But how do you, or what do you do with regards to the foot and ankle? Is that something that is a constant thread through the return to play process, no matter what the injury? What does that look like? How much emphasis do you put on it?
When there's a knee insult, right? I think what I do is I look at how did they move before. and where are the opportunities for me to make them a better mover outside of the knee. I look at the ankle, I look at the hip. We always talk about the hip having 3 degrees of freedom and the foot having 3 degrees of freedom plus, given all the different axes and planes that it has between the rear foot, midfoot, and forefoot. But you have to take in consideration all those aspects as far as the range of motion and the strength throughout those 2 joints I mentioned, because that's going to be, the knee's going to ultimately become the torque converter or take the brunt of what those joints can or cannot do. So one, I'm always putting the ankle and the hip into perspective when I'm building out their programming and their movement qualities. I build in a lot into my workouts. I talked early on about the proprioceptive component. I'll start my rehab with walking A's. They've got a PVC on their shoulders. They're going into a walking A position. They've got to hold. They've got to show me from the foot through the ankle, through the knee, through the hip, that they can stack and they can load and they can stabilize and hold that position with the up leg. And so I'll do that for nauseam of repetition. But because of that, I'm always considering, like we talked about earlier, I need to get them to this running model. So this is maybe a few regressions back from that, but I have to always keep the end in mind while I'm building out these progressions. But to get back for this, I do a ton of backward low walks, a ton of it, to restore as much ankle dorsiflexion as I can with these guys as they're coming back from a knee issue. They deal so much with the patella tendonitis, patellofemoral issues, whether it's because of the surgery or just because of the rehab process or maybe who they were previously, that I'm looking at every opportunity to restore ankle dorsiflexion. I think that is we've always talked about how important it is for performance, but it's vastly important on the rehab side. But then also just the stability and the ability of the tissues of the pelvis to do their job, and lateral stability are key. People sit there all the time. They do gluteus medius work. Gluteus medius work in isolation open chain, which is fantastic. But that tissue's role is to control the pelvis laterally in a closed stance or single-legged stance position.
Sorry, jumping about a bit here, but one thing that gets forgotten about, I think, and I think there's loads more work in this area, which is exciting, and that's deceleration. And again, we spoke about it in Denver when you're in that beautiful backdrop. What are the non-negotiables when retraining deceleration? Obviously, we're moving a little bit further down the return to play path here, but I think that might be interesting because I know you've spoken a lot about deceleration.
Sure. So bilateral, they have to have a clean bilateral squat. They have to, and they've got to be able to load. They have to show me really good requisite of a lunge positioning. They've got to be able to get in a good lunge, deep lunge position where the tibia is going over the forefoot of the foot, the tibia, the knee going over the forefoot. You know what I meant. Tibia moving forward. I need to get that tibial inclination without losing. And here's where I'll get some people probably hating on it, but without the heel coming off the ground. Okay, in that position right now, I want to see how much of that tibial shank that I can get in an acute position over the forefoot. Without the heel leaving the ground, because at that point all you're doing is robbing Peter to pay Paul. So you're not actually gaining any more range of motion. And oh, by the way, as that tibia goes forward, guess what? The soleus and the post tib, like, they're all doing their job of decelerating that tibia over the forefoot. So you're getting incredible deceleration mechanics and I'd say tissue need and the appropriate job, not heel elevated, not seated calves, but you're truly getting the soleus to do its job that it's requested to do in the need of deceleration. So that's a non-negotiable. I've got to have good, I went on a tangent. I need to have good bilateral squat. I need to have an incredible lunge pattern with that tibial angle getting over that forefoot. And you can see when people block. They're either blocking because they're restricted in ankle dorsiflexion or they're blocking because of patella pain. And you'll see that. So I need to make sure I restore that and I pay attention to it. So I'll forward lunge the heck out of my guys and I'll backward lunge the heck out of the guys. And it's the backward lunge is mainly so I'm getting them to load into the lunge and then push back. Can they handle those positions under body weight and then incremental loading? Other non-negotiables I need to restore a lunge lateral component. I think that the lunge lateral is it's tipped my eye over the years, and I think I've maybe spoken on that presentation we did, is going into a frontal plane lunge and being able to sink and fold in that frontal plane lunge. I think is massive for lateral deceleration, but just the ability of all those joints to work in harmony to absorb forces at multiple angles.
How do you develop intensity when it comes to deceleration? As we move to that story again.
Sure. It's funny. I think people always like add intensity by resisting it. And I'm like, well, actually, what you just did is you made it easier on the athlete because now it's assisting their deceleration. So what I do is I make sure that one, I'll either add a load that assists them into acceleration. So now they have to decelerate against a greater load, or I just change the distance and now I make it reactive. All right, your intensity now is going to be at the rate of requirement of deceleration. So say I build in a frontal plane deceleration side shuffle, it's 5 yards. 5 yards, you know the start, you know the stop. Okay, now here I'm going to create a reaction component to it. I create the start, you still know where you're stopping. And now we're going to go into, I'll start you, I'll stop you. And it might be 5 yards, it might be 7 yards, it might be 2 yards. And then I get into reactive or rebounds where I increase that intensity. So intensity based on need of contraction, not necessarily intention or intensity based on the external load, I would say is how I'll build it.
And you spoke a little bit about, well, a lot there about introducing that kind of reactive element towards the end as we again move through that story of return to play. How does that, in terms of deceleration, but how does that then move into other areas of return to play, and how are you making sure that you're not doing that too early, given the progression of tissue healing and all that kind of stuff during any sort of injury?
I build in my reaction really early. I think it was a lot of Dustin Grims's work that I've listened to, and I've said this makes sense, and so I'll build in reaction early. As simple as this: hey, coach, is it on me or is it on you? It's on me. When I clap, when my voice, when I snap, whatever it is on my whistle, then you start your march. So I try to create that reactive idea right from the beginning. That way, it's not this pre-rehearsed idea of how I load and how I do this. I can hopefully get them a little bit more subconscious into how they initiate a movement when it's reactive start. So I'll create it as a reactive start, even though the drill itself is closed. And then I'll do the same, like kind of like what I just verbally told you. Hey, I'm gonna create the start, but you know where you end. You know, shuffle 5. Perfect example of what I did today. My guys were doing every 5 yard XL decel. Every 5 yards. So I'm trying to build in some capacities, some bilateral capacity of acceleration, deceleration, because they have to change their lead leg every rep. But when they decel, it was bilateral decel. And every 5 yards they would do that. And then the next set, hey, how you feeling? Things are good. Everything looks good to my eye. Now I'm going to build in your decel. Now that decel is going to happen somewhere between 0 and 10 yards. And so now that reactive decel, the start and the stop is on me again. So I think that you introduce reactivity right away, but I think the intensity or the requirement of what the reactivity is needs to morph in time as you see that they're on a good trend of healing or adaptation.
To really push on with that reactive element, is there anything that you would assess more globally when it comes to whatever injury it might be to give them the kind of green light to move into that more intense stuff when it comes to reactivity?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to their feedback to me. It comes back to, by that time in the rehab, we are looking at force plate numbers. So we're looking at their ability to bilaterally load as they go into their eccentric phase, as they return right out of the hole in their concentric phase. What's their bilateral capability, their limb symmetry index? And then when they land, what is that braking force when they land? So at this time in the rehab, we're starting to look at those things anyway, because now I need to see that reactive quality. But at the same time, I think that, based on what the injury is, like I'm always going to use the eyeball test to lead me to my next progression of what I'm going to do. I basically take my football players through drills that mimic what they'll do in what's called their individual period. We call it indie period. So I'm going to take them through those patterns and those movements to get them used to those things in a closed nature before they even get to anything that's open. But still, even though they're closed drills, they might be step over bag drills, they might be hoop drills, but whatever it is, I'm going to create the reactive start. And then maybe once I build them into their closed drill, all right, now you've got to sprint off of this, or you got to decelerate on my whistle or my hand. So I'm always kind of building that in as a reactive piece, but it's in progressive steps.
You mentioned symmetry there.
Did I answer your question? I don't know
No,
if I
you
did.
did. You did. I'll probably circle back in a minute, so that's on me, not you. You mentioned symmetry there, and there's been a ton of work on asymmetry and symmetry from since last time we spoke. How much emphasis do you put on asymmetry in the return to play process, and does that change along the continuum?
Yeah, I think it comes down to what was their signature beforehand. They weren't symmetrical beforehand, most likely, as we know, and not sure if symmetry is really the thing that we're really after per se. It's like within degrees, right? You talk to, looking at a lot of Matt Jordan's work, like what is the ideal symmetry? If I don't believe that the asymmetry that they had beforehand was causative of the injury, say it was a full complete contact, then I'm probably trying to restore them back to relative balance of who they were previous to the injury. If I don't believe that that asymmetry was causative in their injury. Um, so I will sit there and say we strive. I think it's a warm fuzzy for all of us to drive for symmetry, but I'm not ultra alarmed when I see asymmetry and I have no pain and I don't see a disparity between left and right.
So we're moving further down this story and this continuum, moving from the linear stuff to the change direction.
hmm
Is there anything there that would give you, okay, this guy or girl's ready? Like they can do 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's move
hmm
them on. Is there anything like that, or is it more
It's
tricky up?
fatigue. It's fatigue based.
Okay.
I think in the early return to play, like, guys have hitches, they have pain, they have discomfort, they have whatever. And then, each week, hey, you know what? When I did this last week, I'm feeling a lot less pain. It feels a lot better. And you can see it in their bend. You can see it in their execution, less apprehension into the ground, whatever your visual cue is. But ultimately, like, for me to sit there and say, you're ready for this next stage, it really comes back to, can you do these series tasks? Can I now dose you with a ton of accumulation and see what changes from a coordinative, tissue response and healing, uh, post training swelling? Like, I have to look at all those variables and sit there and say, are they ready? Can they handle now something in a greater progression? So you have to look at a lot of things, the communication, but I always look to the next day. How do you, like, in time you feel great and you're doing great, but what was the swelling after the fact? What was the pain after the fact? And so I'll ask my questions post session typically, and then I'll follow up with questions the next day. So there's times look, very rarely is there this perfect linear rehab. Like, you've got to regress and then you've got to push and regress and push. It's not going to be perfect, and that's where the art form comes into it. But if they can show me the ability to handle a greater amount of workload under the same pattern, that's when I move to the next thing. So say I'm hammering out linear mechanics. Boom, things look good. Things look good. They're clean. They're not afraid to put their foot in the ground. But I also know right now they're apprehensive to decel linearly. Okay, so I've built the engine a little bit. Now let's go back and now rebuild the braking system, and taking my time in the braking system, because those those forces and those positions are a lot more vulnerable and volatile than any of the linear locomotion stuff. You can get to the linear locomotion stuff and think you're making really great progress. The second you ask them to decelerate, you know that you've got to regress a little bit and build them back into that. So once I've built them back into their deceleration linearly, all right, now let's excel. Now let's put it all together. So I built it in stages.
Is there any constraints or drills that you may introduce to bridge that gap between the linear, the axle and decel, and the
Mhm.
change direction, more reactive stuff?
Yeah, perfect example, frontal plane type work. So if you've heard me present on movement, I always talk in planes, right? And I don't know if I've done that for ease of my mind in the rehab side of things when you back engineer, but we're going to look at things sagittally, we're going to look at things frontal plane, and then a lot of the transverse plane action. That's the bridge. That's the bridge of linear and frontal plane type movement. So I hammer out linear. I introduce teaching. Everybody's always scared to go multi-directional in ACL rehab early, but just like I said earlier, teaching the coordinated patterns, you need to just teach the steps. You need to get the footwork in and just relearn patterns. So once I get them to a point where they're handling linear mechanics pretty well, then I'll start building in the lateral, the pure frontal plane, and it might be hurdle step over. So it's the same pattern. Now I'm just taking it lateral, and now I'm going to have them go over either lateral bags, lateral hurdles, and then I need you to bilaterally decel. Okay, now I'm going to have you single leg decel. Now I'm going to have you decel and then rebound back. And so I'm just going to groove the heck out of that frontal plane movement until I don't see any that deficiency. Same thing in the linear models. I'll build that out big time. Once I start to see that, then I start building in my lateral to linear progressions. So I do block it in a sense early on. And it's teaching, two, it's tissue tolerance and it's tissue capacities. But looking at my linear models as my primary, and then my frontal plane as my secondary, and then I start building in that transverse plane bridge to making more what we would call open drills at that point.
You mentioned at the start around not telling the athlete what's going on as much as maybe you may have done in the past or other people do.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
you move towards this end period, does that change? Do you get them more involved and tell them more? Do you tell them less? Does that
I
change
tell them
along the
less.
story? Okay.
Further we go, I tell them less. I just say, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. Early on, it's negligent if you don't say, hey, how did that feel? Like that's negligent, especially, I've had some couple RTP cases and, if you're dealing with something in season and I need to get true, like, can you do this movement that I'm asking you to do if you're expected to play in 5 days, 7 days, 12 days? So one, I think that communication, it's really nuanced to what time of year this is happening. But if we're looking at the long case scenario, like, I look at my last long case scenario, man, let's go. Let's go. Everything's reactive. I'm going to build you up in very closed drills. And then once we're warm and we're ready to go, like everything's open and we're going. And now I'm just mimicking, work to rest ratios that are going to be consistent with the sport or practice. And so for me, I tell a lot less as I go.
As they're getting towards the end again, how do you balance the reintegration into practice?
Mm. Yeah. And, I haven't done a good enough job on this call explaining really how it's all integrated with,
Okay.
nutrition, psychology, and our head athletic trainer. This is a perfect segue for this is the athletic trainer and I, he's really going to kind of sit there and say, okay, we're going to go with this player into, he's going to do individual periods and he's going to do anything that's non-compete. Okay, when he's not doing the non-compete portion of practice, then I'm going to take him and give him whatever workload he needs now to try to get that movement signature on the catapult that we know that he needs to have to be ready to handle a practice. So that's where the integration comes in a lot more with the head athletic trainer and myself, where we'll have discussion back and forth. Hey, what do you think? What do you think of this timeline? How do you feel he's progressing? Do you feel he needs to regress? Do you think we can go with more volume? And he might sit there and say, you know what? Let's pull back on the running. Let's get him more work on the strength side. So at this point in time, it's very collaborative between he and I. It's very collaborative. He does trust me with all the movement side of things and the accumulation of workload here. So it's a really good win-win for me because I get them early to teach reestablish the coordination patterns and the locomotion patterns, and then he trusts me to take them all the way up to when they start to practice. They're still working in their room as well on the gaps that we don't fill in our room. But at the end of the day, when we're looking at actually getting them back integrated into practice, it's communication between he and I. And that's where we're looking at all the metrics, right? We're looking at our force plate data. We're looking at the catapult data and saying, okay, is this person at that point yet? And then, obviously we're going to be doing, the different testing that they do in our athletic training room as well to make sure they have a green light before we actually put them back into practice.
One thing I've found interesting, the more we kind of move into the rehab space with conferences and content and things, and this maybe comes from this grey area being filled with coaches like specialized rehab coaches, that once athletes transition back into practice, their job doesn't stop. Like, it's not like, right, done, over to you. So in terms of like what you do day to day in your current role, how involved are you continually, even when they have reintegrated in practice and 100% of the drills and practices with everyone else? How far do you go?
They'll still have caps. As they get reintegrated into practice, they'll still have their caps. And once they hit their caps in a more competitive environment, then they're
What do you
pulled
mean
with
caps?
me. It might be a player load cap for the day.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, got it.
Yeah, so they'll have their caps for a day, and if we hit that cap, or whether it's play count or player load or high speed yardage, XL, decels, whatever we determine that cap to be, then they pull them and put them with me, and then I give them whatever gaps they probably need to be. It's usually at that point in time they're getting all their good bursts of XL, decels. So now at this point, it's more just a little bit more capacity work on the conditioning side. So it's still highly involved. It's still communication. Peri practice, like we're having communication during practice between the live tracking on the catapult, me talking to the athletic trainer about what our game plan is once we pull somebody from practice, and what my role is once they're pulled. And again, it's with me. It's not with an intern or an assistant. It's with me at that point.
Nice, mate. Right, I promised you an hour, and we're not far off that hour. So thank you for the time that you've given. I know you're a busy man, jumping from place to place and doing lots of different things. If people want to reach out or get to know you, get to know your work, where's the best place?
Sure. I would say Loren Landow on Instagram is about it. A lot of people confuse it with Landow Performance. If you message me there, I'm not answering that one. So make sure it's Loren Landow. But that's a great place to get me.
Perfect. Amazing. Loren, thank you very much for your time. Can't wait to meet you in June. Really looking forward to having you. And thanks again.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.